This video covers 5 important points for track planning for model railroad yards. The first point is that, well, frankly, you don't always need a yard. Yards themselves always need to have, modelers always want to have them, but they can take a lot of space. And in not every railroad needs one. If you just have a switching layout, you can just have a running track, or maybe not even that. Example, you don't need one there. Or maybe you're doing just a rail fanning, train running type of layout. Just the your mainline track and some passing tracks. That's all you really need. Not everyone needs an actual classification yard on your layout. And now actually we will go into the layout room, and I'll show you my HO switching layout, which doesn't have a yard, and the O gauge railroad also doesn't have a yard. Here on my HO scale switching layout, there is no yard. Just a simple couple of tracks that just go here and end up in a stub. Now this railroad here could be expanded easily enough to either right here to go beyond the end of track here. I could add a short yard or staging yard, or even a real yard off on this end, or I could go back here and punch through the backdrop at the end and create another yard over there if this was in a different locations, rather shoehorned right now. But again, this is the space that I have. My O gauge layout. This layout here is just set up for train running. It just has 2 levels, and it just meant to trains just running around. There's a simple loop on top and a loop on the bottom. Now I do have as a side here, I do have this kind of what I consider to be yard is more of engine terminal industry, but again, it's another place where we have a loop, and we have you could have a yard off of the loop here. It'd be kind of very difficult to do this in the middle of the loop here. The second point is better with placement, and this is really more important if you plan to have multiple yards on your layout. It's important if you're doing multiple yards, is we want to make sure that you never put a yard on 2 yards across from each other on the same aisle. If you have narrow aisles, if you have a yard over here and a yard over here, you need at least 5 feet between the two, mainly because people 18 inches of space, just the body of the person. So a 2-foot aisle, for instance, is only good for a single person. Even 3 feet is too narrow, really, for a single person. 4 feet is the bare minimum space, but you're barely going to get by, and it may not work if you've got control panels and other things that jut into the space. You need 5 feet, so you can have an operator on one side and an operator on the other side, and they can pass by each other. So make sure you don't do it this way. Another caveat here: if you have a multiple deck layout, you want to make sure you don't put a yard directly above another one on a lower deck, because you're going to end up having your operators or end up interfering they're going to interfere with each other. So really the important thing is to make sure just you have adequate space for your yard as far as aisles go, that you can easily access the yard ladders, especially if you're running manual switch controls, or be able to maneuver where and reach the appropriate reach to get to those back tracks. If you're using, again, manually on coupling picks and things, make sure you have actually all of the proper ergonomics in effect for your operators. And also, if you have a small layout, so we have a small layout here with a loop, it's actually better to put your yards on a small shelf on the side. You'll get good. It's a good way to expand your layout, getting bigger beyond just your typical 4x8 or hollow core door kind of setup. And again, you're not necessarily going to have a reach problem. This allows you to have the maximum length tracks for this kind of operation, versus trying to put them here in the inside your oval, which ends up taking out a lot of space, and plus they end up taking space from other things you may want to do in the middle. The third major point is size, and there's a couple guidelines here. So first, we need to have the yard, your yard itself needs to equal the number of industry spots. So what you need to do is count up all the spots on your layout where all your industries are. So if you got one loading dock, two loading docks, this industry takes 6 cars, this takes 2 cars. Add up your interchange tracks, all your industrial tracks, add them all up. That number of total needs to equal the car capacity of the yard. Now, this also works if you have multiple yards on your railroad. You add up all of your industry across your entire layout. That total needs to equal your yard capacity, and it can be split across multiple yards. But you need to have a balance in there. And the idea of this is that you're never going to overfill your industry tracks or your yard tracks, because typically what we want to do is you never want to exceed more than 50% of the capacity on your railroad. So your maximum capacity on your railroad, again, is the combination of your industry tracks plus your yard tracks. You add those up together, that capacity, divide by 2. Then that's the maximum capacity you have. Once you exceed 50% of the capacity on your railroad, all you're doing is switching holes. You're switching holes instead of cars, and you really don't want turn your layout into one of those sliding block puzzles where you're trying to free a piece. That's not the idea here. All that's going to do is frustrate you and frustrate any guest operators, because there's not going to be room to put the cars where they need to go, as per example. Now, also, if you happen to have multiple yards on either end of your layout, as example, you also need to balance them. So again, the yard capacity on one end of the layout needs to equal the yard capacity on the other. Too much out of whack on either end, again, you could send too many cars by trains into the other yard and creating an overfill. You could have something that's adequately sized on one end, but then the other yard is completely overwhelmed. Again, that doesn't become fun, because now you're stacking trains on the main line or in sidings and creating a bottleneck situation. The fourth point is type. Now, there's really kind of three major types of yards. One first kind of yard I would call it like a sorting yard. These might be a yard that's in close to a larger industrial area, and just meant for a place where it's kind of could be storing loads, sorting empties to support industries. And these things where a train will come in, will drop off cuts of cars, and push them to the industries and pull the empties here. Sometimes it's a place to store extra empties for these industries. As examples, doesn't always have to go back to the main yard, and then when the yard is full, this will go back to the main classification yards. The second kind of yard is your classification yard, and again, this is where you're going to have trains coming in off your main line, and they go into the arrival departure tracks. Then they get broken up and classified. That's the purpose of classification. And they get classified into yard tracks. These classifications, the yard tracks, can represent different destinations, different industries, and things like that. And so then later switchers will then take these cars from these yard tracks and make them back into locals, for instance, to serve other regional areas or potentially other divisions, as per example. The third point is kind of like your staging yards. And again, staging yard can just represent kind of a single track, like going off behind a backdrop, representing like an interchange like this, or they represent a branch line or a small yard, or they can do things or you can have big loop yards with half dozen tracks storing freighter passenger equipment. And generally things for like staging, a lot of it's based on density. because a lot of times, again, if you're trying to simulate a double track main line would have 50 trains a day, you're going to need good sized staging yards on both ends to fire, keep your main lines busy. Because a lot of times you can have trains, for instance, that come out of a staging yard, like an external internal kind of trip, starts outside and ends up in your main classification yards. It gets broken up. Conversely, you can have like an internal external kind of trip where a train will be made up in your classification yard and then goes off the layout to an external staging yard. Or you may have an external kind of trip. These are through trips where the trains can go from one staging yard and then off to another staging yard on the other end of your layout. And these are trains that don't have any interaction, and they're good to have trains that maybe you're modeling part of the country where you have some bridge traffic, and it doesn't really, a train goes by that doesn't support any of your local industries, and maybe you got some local lumber type industries, and you have a unit coal drag that comes through, that doesn't have any interaction with your layout at all, but you can easily model it just going through. Same thing with passenger trains. Passenger trains just kind of pass by your main town on your layout. Again, may not have any interaction. It may not even have a depot in your town. It just goes by. But see, that's the kind of things you may need to have to represent that higher density. The fifth point is, I would consider, like style. And this is really, do I want single end or double end? Typically, conversely to what happens in real railroads, the stub end type of yard is probably more common on a model railroad versus a prototype, and it's mainly because of space. Having a yard with a double yard ladder on each end takes extra space. The ladder takes space. It's lots of extra switches, or you may end up find that a number of car capacities on each track get kind of pinched if you have to have room for ladders on both sides, and you can get more capacity if I just have stubs. Sometimes where it can cause some issues with some operations. It's really, I find that a good rule of thumb is if the yard is at the end of your railroad or the end of industrial area, then a stub would probably work fine. If it's in the middle of your railroad, a yard is probably best to be double-ended if you have traffic coming from both directions, and sometimes just having a ladder on one side can make operations kind of inefficient and maybe awkward. Also, if you're modeling a low-density operation, like a secondary main or a branch of some sort, then you probably, a stub probably works fine. You're not going to have that much traffic. However, if you're modeling a high density main line, again, double track, or like Pennsylvania, 4-track main or something, you're going to need double-ended yards to support that kind of traffic load. And of course, this kind of single versus double style works regardless of whatever type of yard we're talking about. If you're doing like a sorting yard for industrial, again, if that yard is at the end of this industrial branch or area, stub works. If it's in the middle and you got yards, industries off both ends, the traffic could come to the yard from both directions, again, the double works, the best. And the same thing goes with classification yards, and the same thing goes with staging yards. Staging yard at the end, you could use your loop yard or a stub. If it's in the middle, you need to have some sort of, probably, double ending. The caveat is that sometimes it's just what fits. Sometimes, again, with everything model railroading, a lot of times we don't have ultimate space. Very few of us have the ultimate amount of space we want. And frankly, what you can fit in is what you can get, and frankly, that is fine. So if you like this kind of content, please give me a like, or comment, or consider subscribing. And thank you for watching.